Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's presentation, Echolocation in the Ecology of Bats, is brought to you by NatHab Expedition Leader Diana Lopez. Diana earned both her bachelor's and master's degrees at National Autonomous University of Mexico, specializing in marine mammals and bioacoustics, and has worked as a marine fauna observer since 2012, collaborating with national and international institutes. Her research and guiding experience spans from studying gray whales and humpback whales in Baja California Sur to following orcas off British Columbia and working as a marine fauna observer off of Tampico. Diana combines her academic expertise in marine mammal bioacoustics with over a decade of field experience in ecotourism throughout Mexico and beyond. Diana, it's great to see you again. Thanks for being here today. The show is yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here again once more, and I really hope you enjoyed this presentation. I'm going to be talking about echolocation and the ecology of bats. And this is a subject that has intrigued me recently because, as Robert just mentioned, one of my specialities is acoustics. So now I'm trying to dig in more into the biology and echolocation of bats. So this is pretty much what I've been finding. I hope you enjoy it. And as Robert mentioned, I'm an expedition leader for the Monarch Butterfly Tour, and now recently I have just been added to the Gray Whale Tour. So I hope to see you there. And well, during this presentation, we will be reviewing a little bit of the concepts that I already explained about the bats, general facts, what is sound, echolocation and adaptations in bats, what is the ecological importance, and myths and realities with bats, and what can you do to help them. Okay, so as I mentioned, I already gave a webinar a little bit explaining about general facts, biology about the bats. And if you want, you can review this information in the webinar that I gave on October 7th, and it is on YouTube already. So also there's amazing other daily dose webinars of my expedition leaders colleagues. And just as a quick reminder, the bats come pretty much in all sizes and shapes and colors. They have a huge diversity. They're actually representing 20% of all the mammals in the world. And we're talking about 1,400 species, more or less, that have been described. And they belong to the order Chiroptera. So this is pretty much what it means, is that they have hand wings. And as we know, they have developed these fingers in such a way with a membrane that it becomes a wing in this case. And well, just recently, they have reassigned names for these order, and now they are called Yangochiroptera and Gympterochiroptera. And before this, they used to be Megachiroptera with all of the old world bats or the fruit bats that are quite huge. That's why the name Mega. And all of the rest belong to Microchiroptera. But now with this recent division, they have pretty much arranged it in this way. And it has to do a lot with some molecular analysis, genetics, and also evolution that they have been tracking down. And it all comes to a hypothetical ancestor that it used to be arboreal and nocturnal. And what is very interesting is that they already studying how they are inside of their skull, they have found out that they had already used ultrasonic calls for communication. And this is pretty much something that the bats use about the sound that they emit. So another interesting thing is that these animals started to evolve around 63 million years ago. This is in the Eocene epoch. And from that, there is a hypothesis that they explained that the evolution of the flight in the bats was from a gliding behavior. And this is very interesting. So this is what I was mentioning. These animals have developed in such a way that their fingers have elongated and they have fused tissue in between them. And this goes from their fingers all the way to their hind limb. And this gives them the opportunity of being the only real flying mammal. Because as you know, there's also some squirrels, but they are gliders. And in this case, this is the only mammal that actually flies. And they have developed a lot of varieties. As I was mentioning, they come in all sizes and shapes. And what is very interesting about this figure is that you can see more or less how they have a lot of diversification in structures, such as in the ears. As you can see, there's some broad ears, there's some larger and smaller ones. Also, the nose, and even the type of the fold in the wing and the type of tail that they have. And all of these are diversifications that allow them to become specialists in the ecosystem that they're living and the type of prey that they feed from. So another quick review is that I mentioned in last webinar that we have one of the smallest bats that is 1 to 1.3 inches long. This is quite tiny. And then you have this other giant golden crowned flying fox that has a wingspan over 5 feet long. So you can see the variety. Also, we know that the Mexican free-tailed bat is actually one of the fastest mammals that there are, and it can reach speeds up to 100 miles per hour in flight. They have a general distribution around the world. You can find bats pretty much everywhere, and with exception of the polar regions. And there is a very huge diversification in the tropical areas. And we know that some of the species migrate. Most of the species that migrate do it because lack of food and because of the temperature that goes hand to hand. And it belongs to the type of species that actually roost. The ones that are in caves, what they do is that they hibernate. But when they migrate, they can create these giant colonies. For example, here in this cave in Texas, San Antonio, where we can have in the summer up to 15 million individuals. And all of the bats have this incredible behavior called roosting, in which they literally hang upside down. And they have special adaptations for this in the sense that they have only one-way veins. And they have a very low pressure, blood pressure, and cardiac rhythm when they are hanging upside down. And as I mentioned, the cave bats usually hibernate. So as we know, they're pretty much everywhere and in all ecosystems, and they can be found from urban cities up to places that are very, very pristine. So, talking a little bit about their diet, we know that most of the bats are nocturnal feeders. And actually, 70% of the bats are insect feeders. And we also have some of them that feed on vertebrates, like frogs or even these fish. Or we can also find that there's a variety of bats that feed on fruit. There's actually only 3 species that feed on blood, and they're only found in Central America, and they're quite tiny, not to be feared about. And we also have some of the bats that feed on nectar and pollen that I explained in the previous webinar, especially those that pollinate the magueyes. So they have become so specialized in some of their pollination, as in the magueyes, that actually the cave nectar bat is the only bat that pollinates this fruit that is, I can't remember the name, the durian fruit. and it's the only species that pollinates durian fruit. But then we also have like this large flying bat that is a pollinator of the bananas, or the Egyptian fruit bat of the peach. So there are a lot of specialization and relations that are called mutualistic, because both of the species are benefits by this relationship that happens a lot between bats and pollinators with specific plants. So also just reminding a little bit about the bat senses I was mentioning on the last webinar. I had a very interesting question about how was their smell. So it turns out, I did my homework, that the bats have a pretty similar smell sense as in any other mammal, but it has been shown that the bats that feed on fruit have very, very sensitive smell sense. And this is because this is the way that they can actually identify if a fruit is ripe and it's ready to eat. Because when we talk about the sight that I already mentioned in the last webinar, they have pretty good sight. People actually used to think that they were blind, but no, they do have a very accurate sense of sight. They do not, cannot actually discriminate among different shades or tones of colors. So this is why they aid themselves in the smell, so they can identify the ripe fruit. And regarding the touch, the membrane is quite sensitive, because just imagine if they're flying and they find an obstacle, they need to sense it immediately, even if it's a prey like an insect. So they are very sensitive in the membranes and the touch sense. And the other ones we will keep on mentioning further. So another thing I wanted to outline is that I found this very, very cute research paper that is actually for young minds, but I really enjoyed it because of the way they narrate this information, that they found that the agave bat has something like a patch, a dorsal patch, in which they accumulate bacteria, and that helps them to create a perfume that attracts the females. So pretty much the smellier a male is in these species, the more attracted a female is going to be. So I hope this answers the question about how is the smelling sense in bats. Okay, now let's go to our main topic about sound. So just to remember, sound is actually a mechanical wave. So what happens is you have an emitter, it emits the sound, and this travels as a wave throughout the particles, as you can see in the video. So these particles oscillate back and forth, transmitting this mechanical wave. And these vibrations create something that is called compression, that is when the particles are pushed together, and rarefication, that is when the particles are spread apart. The interesting thing is that if you have a vacuum zone, then you cannot have sound because it cannot travel throughout the particles. And the closer the particles are, the faster the sound is going to be transmitted. So that is why, depending on the medium, is the speed of the sound. So there are some, let's say, some of the things that are properties that are very important for us to keep in mind, especially when we're talking about these topics, is the frequency, that it is the number of wave cycles per second, and it is measured in hertz. So here you can see we have our wave, and we're measuring the distance or the number of wave cycles that is happening in this time frame. Then we also have something that is called the wavelength. This is the distance between the wave peaks, and we have the amplitude, that it is the distance from the central line of the waveform, and it is pretty much the wave energy. So the higher the amplitude, the more energy it has. And this is measured in decibels. This is actually a logarithmic scale. And some of the things that I was mentioning that is quite important is what is the medium in which the sound is being transmitted. Because if you have the sound transmitted in the air, in which the particles are a little bit more distance apart, remember gas, that the particles are very spread out, then the speed of the sound can reach up to 340 meters per second. Versus in the water, in which you have all the particles more close together, then you can increase the speed up to 4 times, and it is 1,500 meters per second in water. So that is why in another webinar, I was talking about how marine mammals use the sound as one of their main ways of survival inside of this medium. So how do we record the sounds? When we're studying animals, we actually use microphones and recorders. In this case, this is a bat recorder from Wildlife Acoustics, and this allows us to record the sounds in all of their properties. So when we have obtained already our sample of sound, then we use something that is called a spectrogram to visualize the sounds. So these spectrograms are pretty much graphs that allow us to see sounds, and it is on the y-axis we have our frequency measured in kilohertz, and our x-axis is the time. So in this particular example I'm showing you navigational polls for 9 bat species found in New York State. So each one of these calls are a different species. And what is quite interesting is that even inside of the group of the bats, you can find a huge variety also in calls, not only in anatomy and morphology. So here in this case, we're seeing relatively low frequency sounds for bats, that is around 20 kilohertz, up to this northern long-ear bat that it is almost up to 100 kilohertz, which is quite high. So once you have downloaded that data sample, that is the sounds, you can use acoustic software programs to measure all the multiple parameters. Some of them I mentioned already, but obviously there's many more parameters that you can extract from a sample of sound. And this is just for you to more or less have an idea. So what do the software programs measure? When you have a sample of sound, you can measure the frequency, you can measure the duration, you can measure what was the highest frequency in that sample, what was the lowest, and what was, for example, here that they call the knee, that is when your frequency suddenly changed drastically. So all of these properties allow us to identify what are the calls for different species of bats or other animals. So now I have already shown this graph in previous webinars, but I want to highlight that and remember that the human has a hearing range in blue that is between 20 hertz up to 20 kilohertz. That is our hearing range. And if we compare it to other species, then they can go out of that hearing range that humans have. And when they are below the hearing range, we have infrasound. For example, in the case of the elephants, that they can go so low as 5 hertz. And then when it's exceeding that hearing range of humans, then we have ultrasounds that are higher frequency, and these animals are, for example, the bats, marine mammals, or even the cats and dogs. Actually, when I was a kid, my dad used to show me this whistle that was specifically for training dogs, and that human ears can't hear it because we do not have that hearing range. But the dogs do respond to it because they can pick up that sound. So this is pretty much our reference for deciding what is infrasound or ultrasound, the human range spectrum. So in the case of the bats, we can see that they have some of the noises that are sounds that are received by humans and that can actually perceive them. But we also have some sounds that are ultrasonic, that exceed those 20 kilohertz, and they can go up to 120 kilohertz. That is pretty much one of the highest pitch, along with some of the odontosets that you can find in the animal kingdom. And this means that the sounds are emitted in very short wavelengths. We can see that here in this graph, how the low frequency have pretty large waves. And then once we get to the higher frequency, they start reducing in length and they get shorter and shorter and all clamped up. So that is one of the properties that allow the bats to survive in their environment. The emission of sounds, because they use them to detect the positions of everything they have around them in their environment and their prey. And we call this phenomenon echolocation. So echolocation is pretty much a system that the animals have emitting sounds, and then once it reaches some object, then it bounces back, and that echo is received by the emitter, in this case the bats. So that time delay between the emission of the sound and the retrieval of the sound allows the bat to identify what is the distance of the object. And not only that, it can give them information about the surface, about the speed, about the size. Pretty much it is a alternative way of seeing with sound. And this is quite impressive. Not all of the animals have these properties. Actually, you can see that only some of the animals have it, not only the bats, but also I already mentioned the odontosets. And even humans have resembled this system with the submarines. And when we want to track down what is the floor in the ocean, we use this emission of sound beams, and then when we receive the sound, we can more or less know what is the bottom and the bottom of the ocean. So in this case, this is a sonogram or a sound graph. They also call them like that, not only spectrograms. And it is showing the screech of a silver-haired bat, which is this little critter. And you can see you already know that this is the frequency and the time. And we know that the first person that actually coined the term echolocation was Donald Griffin. And once he discovered this, they started, it took a little bit of a while to discover that there were actually more animals using this system. And they demonstrated how the bats rely on sound waves to detect and maneuver through their surroundings. So when we are talking about echolocation, there's different ways in which the animals can actually produce these sounds, and they're very specialized. So for example, in our case, when we speak, your larynx is compressing air to produce sound. And this system is the same as in the bats, as you can see here. So we find in this, this is actually a very interesting research paper in which they are studying how the form of the larynx and the muscles that are around it can show us a little bit of how the bats have evolved and have specialized. And it has a lot to do also with the type of prey that they're feeding on. So in this case, we can see that when we have bats that do not produce ultrasounds, that these actually are only the fruit bats that are not able to produce these larynx sounds. This is their pretty much how is their system. And in the laryngeal system of a bat that produces ultrasounds, you can see how there's a change in the tension and the angles change pretty drastically. So you can see how this is working for these specific bats that produce these sounds. And what is quite interesting is that they found out that depending on the type of depending on the type of group or family is the system of production inside of their larynx. So what I'm trying to say is that, for example, in the case of the rhinolophoida, we have some dorsally modified larynx, and we have the muscles that are quite enlarged here in the upper part. But then we see the Yangochiroptera that also produce ultrasounds, but they have a ventrally modified larynx. So this is very interesting because at the end, this is a convergent evolution. This means that they are not, they did not develop the same system from a common ancestor, but their ancestors developed different echolocation systems in their larynx, and these modifications have served them for the same purpose, that is for echolocation. And in the case of the fruit bats that are the theropody, these have a conserved larynx and they do not have any modified larynx or muscles surrounding. This is like the normal version. So pretty much two major bat groups evolved ultrasonic echolocation independently, and they can find out this by studying the morphologies of the larynx. So this is a little bit more in detail how it would be looking inside of the larynx of a bat. So this information, I took it from this very nice video. If you have a chance to look it up, it's called Understanding Bat Echolocation, How Bats Navigate the Dark, and you can find it in YouTube. And this is a research paper that was published in Nature in 2010. And what they're showing is how these bones have been modified in length and connectivity to other structures to allow them to produce these echolocation sounds. So in this particular case, we're seeing the stylohal bone, that it is quite elongated and it actually connects with the tympanic bone. And then on the other hand, we have, for in this case, for those bats that do not do larynx echolocation, that the stonehull bone is quite reduced and it is not connected to the tympanic bone. So it is believed that this connection actually aids them in being able to pick up the sound and to convert it into images inside of their brains. So it is kind of like an aid for this it is a mechanical way, a way to anatomically explain what is happening inside of the larynx of the bats. So now, what do the bats take in consideration when they're emitting sounds and receiving those sounds? So what they're picking up, or they're relying on discerning into the time separation of the sounds. So here we can see that they're emitting a pulse or a call, and they're taking in consideration and are able to modify this time. And also the frequency. How is it from the ultrasounds, how high is that frequency? So in the case of, for example, the lesser horseshoe bats and the greater horseshoe bats, they can differentiate between their calls and the returning echoes by using the variations in their frequency. So pretty much when they are approaching a prey, they have a sound that is reflected in a higher pitch. So that allows them to identify the returning echo and to know that this is a prey that is close to them. But then we have a hovering prey. In this case, this is a prey that is just flying in the same spot. It is not moving back and forth. And when the bat emits the sound and gets the reflected sound, it is pretty much unchanged. So that means that the prey hasn't moved from that spot. But when they emit this echolocation signal and what they receive is a deeper or lower pitched reflected sound, that means that their prey is further away. So now, why do they need to be emitting these type of high frequency sounds? Well, what happens is that if they would emit low frequency sounds, the most probable situation is that their prey, that is quite small, would not be caught up into these sound waves. So what they're looking is that this sound wave bumps into the insect, so then it can emit an echo, and that's what they're looking for. So if you have a high frequency emission of sounds, the probability of this sound bumping into an object is much higher than if you have a low frequency sound in which the waves are very long and they do not have this high amplitude. So that is why these animals have specialized in high frequency sounds. So the detection possibilities increase substantially when they have these type of emission of sounds. So now, how do bats hear? It's pretty much also very similar way that humans or other mammals hear. But what is very interesting is that they have modified their ears with different structures, and we call these rugositories called tragus. And this tragus, we humans also have it, but they have it much more developed, and it is specialized so they can determine what is their vertical position. That is what they have been finding. And what is interesting is, as I mentioned at the beginning, the ears come in different sizes and shapes because all of these are specializations to be more sensible to detecting the sound of their particular prey. So remember that not all of the bats eat the same thing. So if you're relying on eating an insect, then you definitely want to have the highest specialization level and detection aids that can allow you to receive the sound of a tiny, tiny insect. But in the case of, for example, the bats that eat fruit, they do not need all of these accessories or rugosities or tragus developments because they do not rely on a prey that is actually moving. They are relying more on their sight, actually, so they can identify the fruit that they're going to eat. So now I want to talk a little bit more about how do they feed. So now when an animal is feeding using echolocation, what they do is that they start emitting pulses or calls very spaciously. So they do not do it fast, they do it actually slow and intermittent, and this can have a time lapse of 5 to 20 calls in 1 second. This is very, very short or very low. But then once they have identified a prey or an object, then they start increasing that emission of calls or clicks. So now from emitting in a very slow rate from 5 to 20 calls, they start emitting faster rates of calls between 20 and 50 calls. So when they reach this phase, it is called an approach phase. And once they have detected or picked up that higher pitch sound that we already saw in the previous slide, that when the object is close, then they start emitting even faster calls per second. We're talking about up to 200 calls per second. And it is such a way that they're so close together that we call this a buzz. And this means that the predator is very close to the prey and it's almost about to catch it. So here what we are seeing in this image also, not only the foraging stages, but also we are seeing that they are able to modify not only the frequency, but also the speed, right? So we call this a modulated emission of sounds. And this is quite interesting acoustic behavior in these animals. So this is how you would find it in a spectrogram. And this is like if you take all of the colors that actually mean the intensity of the sound. And it is easier to study, for example, the time in between the clicks when you have these type of diagrams. So what people usually study when they're looking into foraging behaviors is the time in between the calls. We call it an interclick interval, and it helps us to identify in which phase are the animals actually, if they are only in the search phase or they actually did encounter a prey, and if they are getting close to that prey. So what is very nice is to see that not only they have diversified their anatomy and morphology, but also the type of calls that they emit can be very, very different depending on the habitat, on the prey type, on the evolution, on which family they belong to. So here in this scheme, we can actually see what type of echolocation calls they have depending on the species. And this is very, very interesting because it is very diverse. So this is another example of how not only of the shape and the form of the calls, but also the frequencies. You can see here that there are some species that have very high frequencies. For example, here this northern long-eared bat can reach up to 74 kilohertz. And then in comparison, you have this silver bat that can emit up to 28 kilohertz. So they can vary in such a way that you can actually identify the species depending on the call. So this helps a lot, especially with animals that you cannot see that easy. For example, in my case that I study the vaquita, you never see that animal because it is the smallest cetacean in the world, 1.5 meters, 4.5 feet. It's out there in the water and it's almost getting extinct. And the only way I can study it or know that it's actually there is by their sounds. So this aids a lot for different type of animals that are cryptic or that have nocturnal behaviors. So another interesting thing is that these bats also reduce the call production when they are leaving their roost to reduce the predator detection. So depending on the environment also is the type of sounds that they're going to be emitting. So for example, here we also have different echolocation calls, but this is easier for you to compare or to visualize. And some of them have broader frequencies than other species. For example, the hoary bat has a relatively low frequency to be a bat, that is around 20 kilohertz. And it doesn't change much. But then if you compare it, for example, here with the northern long-eared bat, this critter goes from 45 kilohertz up to almost 100 kilohertz. So this is a pretty wide frequency that it is emitting. So definitely helps us to identify only by the sound what species it is. And you can actually do that also with birds. I am sure that there's pretty great birders, I hope, listening to this talk. And when you're out there and you don't actually see the bird, but you can hear it, some people have developed very good ear to identify the species of the bird only by its sound. So it happens the same with the bats. So I mentioned that there has been a lot of changes in their facial structures that can aid them to find their prey, or that determines if it can be easier for them to feed. For example, in the case of the nectarivore, they need to have very long snouts so they can reach the pollen. And in the case of the frugivore, they need very strong jaws so they can break or eat the fruit. And in the case of the insectivore, they have a lot of accessories in their face so they can detect easier the sound that is bouncing back from their prey. So I found these very interesting studies that they are literally finding that this morphological innovation in skull and jaw structure was a key enabler for the bats to have a dietary expansion. So these two research papers are also there. You can access them free online. And if you like this theme or topic, you can just message me and we can talk more about it. But basically what they're saying is that the skull shape evolved first, and this enables dietary shifts. So once they have a diversification in these type of skull shapes, then it's easier for them to explore other possible prey or food. And this helps them also when they do not have that much competition with other species because they specialize in different food. So this is also a very interesting image of one of the research papers that I just showed you from this one, the morphological innovation, diversification, and invasion of a new adaptive zone. And in this image, you can see what is their relationship, how close they are evolutionarily speaking, and what type of skull they have and what they're feeding on. So here I was mentioning they need very long snouts when they're nectar feeders, but then if you compare it with all of the insect, frog, and blood feeders, you have all of these different morphologies and versus the fruit feeders. So an interesting fact is that, remember I mentioned that only the Yangoptera is, it contains this russet theropodid family, and this theropodid family are the only bats that cannot do laryngeal echolocation. But what is very astonishing for me, and I just discovered that, is that they actually produce sounds with their tongue. So they can echolocate, but using their tongue. So it's like a clicking that it resembles pretty much the function of laryngeal echolocation, but they're doing it with tongue clicks. And this research paper can give you more information about it. But what they're showing you here is that the insectivores that use laryngeal calls use the incoming echoes to set an optimal path to intercept the prey in this image. And then in the case of the frugivores, that remember that they have a very keen sense of eyes and sight, then they can use also spatial memory to take shortcuts between two known locations that they already know that it has fruit. And then once they get to that area, then with the clicking, then they can determine where is the fruit that they're looking for. And with the smell, they can identify which one is correct to eat. So an interesting thing about sound is that, well, it's not only the sound that the animals produce, but you are in an environment full of sound. And we call that a soundscape, in which you have, instead of a scape of a landscape, you have sounds from different sources. And this can sometimes generate something we call clutter. So pretty much the clutter is any noise that can bounce back the echoes, and this creates overlapping and masks the detection of the prey when, for example, in this case, a bat is trying to echolocate. So this bat is trying to find an insect, and then the sound that it emits for the insect also bounces back on the leaves, and then the leaves return these echo and produce clutter. So it is kind of, it confuses an animal that is trying to find its prey. So what has happened is that they have developed different strategies to help in this situation. So it is kind of like when you are in a party and you are listening to so many people and you want to just listen to your friend that is right next to you. So what is our natural action is to raise your voice, right? So pretty much that is what we're observing in these animals. And just think about it. It's not only the leaves that is reflecting the echoes. You can find the sounds bouncing back from walls, branches, rocks, even other animals. So there's many echo overlapping. And now think about these animals. Just picture yourself. Some of them live in forests, some of them live in deserts. So they have different environments or soundscapes, and they have to adapt to that particular soundscape in order to find their prey. So whenever this effect happens, we call it an acoustic masking, or we can call it the party effect. And in this image that I extracted from this research paper from guild structure and niche differentiation in echolocating bats, you can see how different bats that forage, for example, here in an open space, are going to have different sound emissions or call emissions than those animals that actually are inside of the forest or in an area that is with a very strong or heavy soundscape that can receive bouncing echoes from pretty much everywhere. So you see, when it is an open space, they have these type of emissions versus when we have a very narrow space or a very saturated soundscape, then look what happens. They are pretty much raising up their frequency in order to find their objective, or in this case, their prey. So this gives you an idea of more or less, again, how these call emissions can vary depending on the species. So the call pretty much design matches the foraging habitat. And in this very nice research paper about geometric morphometric approaches to acoustic signal analysis, you can find that these type of sounds that are emitted by this great horseshoe bat, that is this little critter, look at this, the size and the shape of this call, and this animal is in an open space, and this is a hunting habitat. It is uncluttered, doesn't have that much noise, so they can have the emission of sounds that are long. And these long range sounds can detect the insects that are flying in these open spaces. But then if you look at these other three species, we're talking about foragers that used to forage in clutter spaces or moderate cluttering spaces, and look how the calls shift, or they increase substantially in the frequency that they're emitting. So here we're talking about nocturne, this little one, netter's bat, and the common pipistrelle. So these foragers that are in cluttered spaces use short and constant frequency calls, and they're designed for higher resolution detection of prey. And in the case of those animals that are foraging in edge space areas, they emit frequency modulated calls with moderate duration. So this allows them to balance these open areas versus the limits of the cluttered areas, and they're modulating these sounds, which is quite interesting. It's not like they're emitting this beam constantly, but they're shifting it according to their environment and to detect their prey. So what is also very interesting is that it's not only about all this anatomy features that allows them to detect the sounds that are coming back, but it also has a lot to do on the anatomy of the animals and morphology that allows them to have more or less maneuverability. So in the case of the animals that feed on insects, imagine they need to have, like for example, this one that is an insectivore, Tadarida brasilensis. This one needs a very high maneuverability so it can chase the insect and do all these very shortcut movements in order to eat. And if you compare it with nectarivore, well, they do not need to have that high maneuverability, but it is interesting that they can reach very high speeds and they can travel very far. Okay, so it has a lot to do also with their anatomy and the size of the wing. And another interesting thing is that there are different foraging strategies or guilds of bats. So a guild is, in ecology and animal behavior, a group of species that exploit the same type of resources in a similar way, even if they're not closely related. So in this sense, we have three different types of adaptations. We have gleaning bats, we have aerial hawkers, and we have clutter adapted species. So it tells you this information tells you a little bit about what are the echolocation traits, if they're low intensity, high intensity, or they can modulate them. What type of prey? In the gleaning bats, for example, we have slow moving insects, and that's why they do not need to invest in having such high intensity sounds, because they're very slow moving insects. And in this case, the aerial hawkers, they need fast, and they need to have sounds that can pick up the echoes very quick, back and forth, and narrowband calls, because they feed on fast-flying insects. And in the case of the clutter adapted species, they have adapted their sound emission and reception for insects that are usually near vegetation, in resting or slow flyers. So these are some representative species, and here you can see the images of the fringe-lipped bat and the big brown bat. The big brown bat is an example of an aerial hawker, and the other one is more of a gleaner. So I'm going to go very quick now with this one. So just to highlight that the bats are not the enemies, they're actually very important for ecological processes, and they are one of the main helpers when it comes to insects. When we have so many insects, you do not need to be putting pesticide in the crops, because the bats are going to be taking care of that. And I already mentioned 70% of the bats are insectivorous. So why don't we just let them do their job and be happy, all of us? And then we also have the pollinators. I already mentioned some of them are very specialized, and they have developed such a mutualist relationship that it is so important for them to continue with this process. And also because they're very strong seed dispersers. So I really like this image, because we have this idea that all of the bats carry rabies, and actually no, the probability of somebody getting finding a bat that has rabies is less than 0.5% of all the bats. And this is the same as if you toss the coin 8 times and you get the same result. So it is minimum. And then there's a lot of misconceptions about the bats. All of them carry diseases, and no, not necessarily. I mean, some of them do carry diseases, but not all of them. And they're pretty much just as scared as we are of them. So the less contact we can have among each other is the best, so we can both go our ways. And the fact that people have this idea that bats drink human blood, no, we already saw that there's only 3 species, and the amount of blood that they need is just equivalent to a tiny dropper test that you would be taking in when you go for a blood sample, and they're not even interested in human blood anyway, so nothing to worry about. And I really like this video also. If you have a chance to find it, it's TED Ed, The Truth About Bats. I extracted this image from there. So what can you do? You can install a properly designed bat box, a shelter for bats, discourage the use of pesticides, very important. Avoid going into caves because they're hibernating, and whenever we're resting, we don't like people going into our rooms, right? So it's the same with the bats. And also, if you come across a bat, don't attempt to handle it. Just call animal control. And if you have unwanted bats in your attic or in your barn, you can just contact your local government, and they already have all the training and the gear so they can relocate these animals, and everybody's going to be okay. So this is just an image I found, what you can find in Amazon if you just text in bat house, and it's quite interesting. I hope some of you get inspired and try to help them. And also in my previous webinar, I explained that there's some web pages where you can go in and also see all the list of plants that you can put in your garden to help also these type of pollinators to arrive. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. Any questions?
All right, thank you, Diana. All right, so if we do have any questions, you can submit them via the question field in your control panel. Just go to the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You see the 3 lines there? Click on those and submit your questions in the question field. You did actually answer a couple of the questions that we did already get, and we don't seem to be having a lot more at this time, Diana. So I'm just going to throw it back to you for any closing comments you may have for us.
Well, I just want to say thank you to everyone that had a chance to log in into this webinar, and to remember that I think the information is the most powerful tool that we have for conservation. So if you really like this information, just go into the research papers that I showed. I mentioned some videos as well, and you can share it with your family and friends, and especially with the kids. I think that we can just change the minds of the kids at this early stage so they can start doing something to help preserve these beautiful and interesting animals.
Well said, Diana. Thank you so much. We appreciate you taking the time to present this for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. If you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at 800-543-8917 or send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and the replay will be available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.